The ballroom of the Willard Intercontinental in Washington, D.C. shimmered under crystal chandeliers. The annual Unity Gala had drawn politicians, journalists, and artists from across the spectrum, left, right, and in between. Though labeled nonpartisan, everyone knew where most of the attendees leaned. And tonight, whispers traveled faster than champagne. "Is that her?" one reporter murmured. "Yes, that's Karoline Leavitt." She had just stepped through the double doors, dressed in a sleek black gown, her signature silver cross glinting near her collarbone. At 27, she was already the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. Sharp-tongued, unapologetically conservative, and, in this room, an outsider. People didn't confront her openly. They didn't have to. The smirks, the raised eyebrows, the overly polite greetings, those were enough. Karoline noticed, but she didn't flinch. At her side stood Mark, her longtime advisor and closest ally. "Are you sure you want to be here?" he asked in a low voice. "Of course," she said, calm as ever. "They think this room belongs to them. I'm just reminding them it doesn't." From across the hall, a group of progressive commentators eyed her like vultures circling a fox in a suit. In their midst stood Ethan Caldwell, a celebrated pianist and activist known for his fiery, anti-conservative rhetoric. His smile stretched as he spotted her. "Well, look who graced us tonight," he called out, lifting his glass. "The White House's piano-pounding spin machine." Laughter, a few gasps, a pause in the music. Karoline didn't react. Ethan stepped closer, still smiling. "Tell me, Karoline, do you do anything other than repeat talking points? Ever create anything yourself? Or is destruction more your brand?" She met his eyes and replied evenly, "You mistake clarity for destruction. But I wouldn't expect you to know the difference." "Ouch," someone muttered. Before Ethan could respond, the host of the evening walked onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, in a few minutes, we'll invite our musical guests to the piano. If anyone feels brave enough, the stage is open." Ethan grinned wider. He looked directly at Karoline. "Care to show us what freedom sounds like?" he said mockingly, gesturing toward the grand piano in the corner. "Or is that too risky without a teleprompter?" The crowd chuckled, amused. Karoline stood still. Mark leaned in. "Don't take the bait." But Karoline wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking at the piano. Black, glossy, perfectly tuned. A flood of old memories rushed forward. Quiet New Hampshire nights, a worn church piano, melodies she hadn't touched in years. She turned back to Ethan, her voice soft but clear. "You want music? Be careful what you wish for." The room buzzed with layered reactions, laughter, surprise, curiosity. Karoline's response wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a perfectly played note. Ethan raised his eyebrows. "Oh, you're serious?" he said, his tone still laced with mockery. "Well then, by all means, entertain us." A few guests chuckled, expecting a disaster. Others leaned in, sensing a moment they didn't want to miss. After all, what could Karoline Leavitt, a political mouthpiece, possibly know about performance? Mark touched her elbow. "You don't have to prove anything." She looked at him, a flicker of calm in her eyes. "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm remembering who I am." She stepped forward. All eyes turned. The lights from the chandeliers reflected off the polished black piano like water. A thin spotlight had been left on, casting soft shadows on the floor. Karoline approached it slowly, each step echoing like a countdown. She didn't rush. She sat. For a moment, she didn't move, just placed her hands gently on the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly. It had been years. A quiet church piano in New Hampshire was far from a Steinway at a D.C. gala. Someone in the back whispered, "She's going to freeze." Ethan folded his arms, already preparing a joke for when she stumbled. Karoline took a breath, and then she played. The first notes were gentle, familiar, clair de lune, delicate, subtle. A melody not of politics, but of peace. Her fingers moved like they were rediscovering language. At first, the room was simply curious. Then, it was silent. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step. The laughter died. Karoline's right hand danced across the higher octaves, while her left grounded the rhythm in warm, deliberate harmony. She wasn't just hitting notes. She was telling a story of tension and grace, of being underestimated, yet still showing up. Ethan shifted, arms still crossed, but his smirk had faded. Karoline kept going, her eyes closed now. She wasn't playing for the room anymore. She was playing for herself, for the girl who used to sneak into the church after hours just to play in peace, for the woman who had buried that side of herself to survive in a brutal political world. She struck the final chord, holding it until it faded into silence. A second passed, then another. And then, applause, not polite, not hesitant, explosive. People stood, some with tears, others with wide eyes and stunned faces. Karoline stood, nodded once, and returned to her table, quietly, gracefully, like nothing had happened. She didn't even glance at Ethan. She didn't have to. Karoline returned to her seat with quiet composure. Her hands, still warm from the piano, now rested gently in her lap. Mark sat beside her, wide-eyed, barely speaking. "Where the hell did that come from?" he finally whispered. She smiled faintly, eyes forward. "A part of me I left behind." Across the ballroom, the applause still echoed in conversations. Guests huddled in small groups, retelling the moment like they'd witnessed a miracle. The political lines that had divided the room when Karoline walked in? For a moment, they'd vanished. She had done what few could, united a crowd in awe. And yet, Ethan Caldwell remained seated. He hadn't clapped. He hadn't moved. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched. The spotlight that once glowed so naturally on him had, for the first time, turned elsewhere. And he wasn't taking it well. A woman beside him leaned over and whispered, "You didn't tell us she could actually play." Ethan forced a smile. "She's trained, polished, probably rehearsed that piece for days." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Still hit every note." He didn't respond. The gala program resumed with a speaker from a nonprofit on stage. But no one was truly listening. Eyes kept drifting back to Karoline. Even the host glanced her way before adjusting his notes, clearly realizing the night had shifted. Moments later, a man in a tailored gray suit approached her table. Senator Owens, an independent known for never taking sides. "I've seen a lot of performances in this town," he said with a slight grin, "but that was the first one that made people actually forget politics." Karoline nodded. "Maybe that's the point." Owens looked at Liberty, who sat quietly beneath the table, her eyes trained on Karoline. "That her service dog?" he asked. Mark nodded. "Federal medical certification." The senator smiled. "That dog didn't stand, but somehow she made the whole room rise." When he left, Karoline finally allowed herself a breath. "Was it enough?" she asked Mark quietly. He looked at her. "Karoline, you didn't just play a song. You shut them up. With grace." A murmur spread through the room. Ethan was heading toward the stage. The host smiled nervously. "Our next guest, a longtime friend of the gala, and celebrated musician, Mr. Ethan Caldwell." Ethan took the microphone, piano behind him, eyes sweeping the crowd. "I'm usually up here to move people," he began, "but it seems I've already been moved tonight." The crowd chuckled lightly. Ethan glanced at Karoline, just for a moment. "But I'd like to remind everyone, skill isn't truth. Sound doesn't mean substance." Gasps rippled through the room. Karoline's face didn't move, but her eyes sharpened. Ethan stood beneath the ballroom lights like he had countless times before. But something was different now. The air was heavier. The audience didn't lean in. They waited, guarded. His words had sliced through the fragile unity Karoline's music had created, and people felt it. Still, he pressed on. "We live in a time," Ethan continued, "where style can replace substance, where carefully rehearsed moments can distract from deeper truths. We shouldn't let one pretty melody make us forget who stands for what." He sat at the piano, stretched his fingers, and began to play. The notes came fast, technical, intricate, cold. It was brilliant in form, but hollow in feeling. A showcase, not a story. Karoline watched in silence. He played a complex arrangement of a modern piece, filled with dissonant chords and dramatic pauses. But the crowd didn't move the same way. No one whispered, "Wow." No one teared up. When he finished, there was polite applause. Nothing more. He rose, bowed stiffly, and walked off the stage without a word. Mark leaned over to Karoline. "That was calculated." "He played like it was a contest," she said softly. "And you?" "I played like I remembered who I was." The program moved on, but whispers flew across tables. "I thought Ethan would blow her out of the water." "He played like he had something to prove." "She didn't even seem like she was trying." Karoline sipped her water calmly. Liberty, still lying at her feet, yawned. The moment was hers now, quiet but undeniable. Then someone unexpected approached. Cassandra Rowe, a liberal columnist notorious for tearing into conservatives. "I've written about you before," she said bluntly. "I know," Karoline replied. "You weren't kind." Cassandra cracked a faint smile. "Tonight, I'm reconsidering." She paused, then added, "Not because you changed your views, but because you reminded us that people are more than positions." Karoline nodded. "That's the difference between volume and voice." A long silence stretched between them, respectful, real. Cassandra extended a hand. Karoline shook it. Across the room, Ethan saw the handshake and froze. The crowd wasn't clapping for him anymore. They weren't listening to him. They were watching her. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the center of the story. The event continued. Speeches resumed, wine flowed, laughter returned. But something about the atmosphere had shifted. Karoline's performance was over. Her moment had passed. Yet people kept stealing glances at her table, not to gawk or mock, but to understand. Something had changed in their perception of her, and most of them couldn't quite put it into words. She wasn't a headline anymore. She was human. "I can't believe you didn't even hesitate," Mark said, as he checked his buzzing phone. "You really just walked up there like you owned the room." "I didn't need to own it," Karoline replied. "Just reminded I belonged there too." Liberty gently nudged Karoline's foot under the table, as if confirming her thought. Karoline smiled and reached down to rub behind the dog's ear. Meanwhile, Ethan sat with his usual crowd, but the dynamic had changed. His friends were quieter, their usual praise replaced with mild distraction. One of them, Mia, an outspoken activist and longtime supporter, leaned in. "You came off a little bitter, Ethan," he scoffed. "I came off honest." Mia didn't argue. She just stared at her wine glass. "It didn't feel like you were playing for us. It felt like you were playing against her." Ethan didn't respond. From the other side of the room, Senator Owens approached Karoline again, this time with another guest in tow, a senior policy advisor from a centrist think tank. "Miss Leavitt, I'd like to introduce someone who'd love to speak with you about next month's education forum." Karoline shook the advisor's hand, her voice polite and professional. "I'd be honored." As they talked, others began to approach, guests who had ignored her earlier in the night. They weren't suddenly allies, but they were curious, respectful. Some asked questions. Some gave compliments. One woman simply said, "You reminded me of my daughter." Karoline answered each one with grace, humility, and clear purpose. Ethan watched it all from his corner. He'd once owned these nights, these rooms. But now, it was hers. He rose quietly and slipped out a side exit without saying goodbye. Mark noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he turned to Karoline with a grin. "You didn't just win them over. You made them feel." Karoline nodded once. That's what music is supposed to do. Liberty lifted her head again, as if to agree. And though the piano now sat untouched at the front of the room, its final notes still lingered, in every mind, in every conversation, in every silence that had followed. The gala ended late, but the conversation didn't. As the ballroom slowly emptied, groups lingered near the coat check and lobby, still processing what they'd witnessed. Not the speeches, not the awards, but Karoline's quiet command of the room. Back inside, the piano sat untouched beneath the spotlight, like a monument to the shift in atmosphere. Karoline didn't linger. She and Mark stepped into the lobby, with Liberty walking close at her heel. A few people stopped her for photos. Others simply offered a quiet nod of respect. Mark checked his phone again. "We're getting press requests already. Politico, The Hill, 2 morning shows." Karoline raised a brow. "All from one piano piece?" "You didn't just play," he said. "You challenged the narrative." Just as they reached the doors, Cassandra Rowe, the liberal columnist from earlier, appeared again. She held her phone, screen glowing. "I published a short column just now," she said. "It's titled, 'When Grace Plays Louder Than Politics.'" Karoline blinked, surprised. "You wrote that?" "I did," Cassandra said, "and I meant it." Then she turned and left, her coat billowing behind her. Outside, the air was cool and crisp. The city hummed as it always did, but Karoline felt a quiet inside her. Settled, strong. As they waited for the car, Mark finally asked the question that had been on his mind since the performance. "Why that song? Claire de Lune?" Karoline thought for a moment. "It's not a song that demands attention. It invites it, just like I had to." Mark nodded slowly. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "No," she said honestly. "I just knew I couldn't let the moment pass." The car pulled up. As Karoline opened the door, she looked down at Liberty, who stared up at her with calm, intelligent eyes. "We did okay, didn't we?" Liberty wagged her tail once. Inside the car, Mark scrolled through X. "Look," he said, turning the phone. "Number sign Karoline Plays is trending. Thousands of posts. Even people who usually hate us are calling it unexpectedly moving." Karoline leaned her head back against the seat. She wasn't thinking about politics anymore. She was thinking about the keys beneath her fingers, the silence before the applause, the way the room had listened, not to her words, but to her story. And in a town where everyone talks, that was something rare. 3 days later, Karoline stood backstage at the National Arts Forum. She'd been invited as a surprise guest, not to talk policy, not to debate, but to share her thoughts on the intersection of politics, perception, and art. She hesitated as she looked out at the elegant auditorium. Rows of thinkers, musicians, and critics, all with pens and skepticism, waited on the other side of the curtain. Mark approached. "Are you sure about this? Most of them didn't exactly applaud you last year." Karoline adjusted the small cross pendant at her neck. "That's what makes it worth saying." When her name was announced, polite applause filled the room. She stepped up to the podium, calm, poised, her notes tucked into the side of the lectern, but she didn't read from them. "I'm not a trained musician," she began. "I never studied in Paris. I didn't grow up in symphony halls. I learned on a worn-out church piano in a small New Hampshire town. It was off-key. The seat wobbled. And I loved it." Some in the crowd smiled, surprised. "I left music behind when I chose a different path. Or maybe I thought I had to. Because in politics, we're trained to hide the parts of us that feel too human." She paused. "But last week, I sat at a piano in a room that wasn't built for me. People laughed before I played. Some rolled their eyes, and I don't blame them. I might have done the same. We make fast judgments in this country about who's worthy of a voice." Now the room was silent. But when I played, something happened. Not just in the room, in me. I remembered who I was before the press briefings, before the headlines, before the dividing lines. She glanced briefly at Liberty, lying beside the stage, calm and still. "I didn't play to impress. I played to remind people that conviction doesn't have to shout, and neither does pain or hope." When she finished, there was a pause. Then someone in the back stood, then another. Then the room rose, not out of politics, but recognition. They weren't applauding Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary. They were applauding Karoline, the artist they never expected. And Liberty, her silent companion, just wagged her tail, knowing what the applause truly meant. Weeks passed, but the moment hadn't faded. Karoline's performance at the Gala had become more than a viral clip. It was a conversation starter. Not just about her, but about the roles we're expected to play and who's allowed to surprise us. Late one Friday evening, Karoline sat at home in her modest D.C. apartment. The White House was quiet for once. The political noise had dulled. Liberty was curled up near the window, eyes closed, calm as ever. Across the room stood a new addition, a classic upright piano. Not polished, not grand, but honest. She had it delivered the week after the Gala, a gift to herself, a reminder. She sat down gently, brushed the keys, and began to play, not for cameras, not for applause, but for peace. A soft version of Claire de Lune filled the room. The same piece, a different purpose. Midway through, Liberty stirred. Not because of a sound, but because of what she felt. Ease. Home. Karoline paused, smiled, then kept going. Her phone buzzed on the side table. She let it ring. She didn't need the world right now. Outside, the city moved on with its deadlines, debates, and noise. Inside, there was only stillness and music. A few days later, she received a package. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, cream-colored paper. "Your playing reminded me that passion and discipline can live in the same soul. I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again. E.C. Ethan Caldwell." She folded the note slowly and placed it in a drawer, not out of pride, but as a quiet closure. Karoline had never set out to win a cultural war. She didn't plan to steal a stage. She just refused to stay small. Not in silence. Not in sound. As she played the final chord, Liberty lifted her head and looked toward her. For a moment, no one needed to speak, because the truth had already been played. In a room filled with power, noise, and judgment, one woman sat in silence and let the piano speak. Karoline Leavitt didn't argue. She didn't fight for attention. She simply played. And in that moment, everything changed. She reminded us that we are more than our labels, that behind the podiums, opinions, and headlines, there are people. People with stories, passions, and gifts the world doesn't always expect or welcome. The crowd came to mock her, but they left with something else: respect, and a new kind of understanding. Because courage doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just takes a seat and plays. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe to Brano Stories. Here, we believe in kindness, dignity, and the quiet power of being true to yourself. And remember, you don't need permission to surprise the world, just the courage to begin.